Professor Raskin isn't unusual, is he? Or is he just the cleanest example of a dirty habit Washington learned to treat like background noise? Because once you step back from the bright lights of that town hall, once the applause fades and the cameras stop hunting for reaction shots, the bigger question starts tapping you on the shoulder like it paid for a seat, too. If one man can preach ethics with a straight face while his paperwork tells a different story, what does that say about the culture that keeps handing him the microphone? And if the culture is the real problem, why do we keep pretending the problem is always just one person, one scandal, one headline, one convenient villain we can boo and move on from? Maybe the most revealing part isn't what Vance said. It's how easy it was to build a whole case out of documents anyone could pull up, if they were actually curious. That's the thing people don't want to admit out loud. It's not that the information is hidden in a locked vault guarded by dragons. It's that most of us are too tired to read it, and the gatekeepers know it. So the system runs on fatigue, on distraction, on the comforting lullaby that it's all complicated. And the best con is the one that tells you you're not smart enough to understand the con. Raskin's brand has always been built on that vibe. The professor tone, the moral vocabulary, the citations to founders like their personal friends who text him back. And to be clear, none of that automatically means anything sinister. But it does raise a question. When did sounding virtuous become a substitute for being accountable? Because accountability is usually boring, right up until it isn't. A disclosure form isn't cinematic. It's not a viral clip. It's not a mic drop moment. It's a PDF that looks like it was designed by someone who hates eyesight. But that boring little form is where a lot of the trust lives, because it's where the public is supposed to see whether their representatives have interests that might tug the steering wheel. If the rule is, tell people your spouse's big financial wins within a reasonable window, that's not a philosophy seminar. That's a calendar. So when a timeline gets stretched, the question isn't just, was it late? It's, why did the clock only matter when someone else started watching it? And that's where the town hall story, the stagecraft, the call and response starts to matter less than the pattern. Because the pattern isn't one late form, the pattern is late, then excused, then forgotten, then replaced by a new lecture delivered with the same confidence. It's the old trick where the person accused of failing a standard responds by raising the standard for everyone else, like that somehow cancels the original problem. If you've ever dealt with a boss who missed every deadline but still sent you a motivational email about time management, you already understand the vibe. The only difference here is the boss writes letters to the Chief Justice and calls it reform. Now, you can argue that any paperwork delay is just that, a delay, and maybe in a different world, that argument would land. But the political world isn't a different world. It's a world where symbolism is currency, and timing is a language all its own. When you're actively positioning yourself as the ethics guy, the transparency guy, the how dare you guy, you don't get to act shocked when people judge you by your own brochure. So the question becomes less about one form and more about the moral posture that's been sold to voters for years. Is it a posture built on principle, or is it a posture built on knowing your audience won't ask the follow-up? And follow-ups are what the whole night was designed to force. Vance didn't need to declare anyone guilty, he just needed to keep stacking "how does that square" moments until the square ran out of room. You can call it political theater, sure, because everything on television is theater. But theater still reveals things people don't want revealed. A professor can talk beautifully about the founders and still flinch when the conversation turns into dates and documents. If you want to know what someone fears, don't listen to their speech. Watch what makes them start adjusting their glasses like they're trying to hide behind the frames. The first tension point was the simplest one. You say disclosure matters, so did you disclose on time? Not, are you a criminal? Not, should you be jailed? Just, did you do the basic thing you demand others do? And that's a question that hits harder than 1,000 grand speeches, because it drags the argument out of the clouds and back onto paper. If the answer is, I was late, then the next question writes itself. Late compared to what standard, and whose standard? Because the people watching at home don't get 8 months of grace from the IRS just because life got hard, and life gets hard for everybody. That's where the room gets uncomfortable, because the audience on the left wants a story about moral leadership, and the audience on the right wants a story about elite hypocrisy, and the paperwork doesn't care what story you want. The paperwork is indifferent, like gravity, and the only real debate is whether we're going to pretend gravity is partisan. Raskin tried to climb back up into the safe space of theory, because theory is where you can argue forever without answering anything. But theory doesn't erase a timeline, it just gives you a fancy way to describe why the timeline shouldn't count. And people are tired of fancy descriptions, because fancy descriptions are how the powerful keep telling the powerless to relax. Then came the second tension point, and this is where the questions get sharper without ever needing to say the quiet part out loud. If a spouse leaves government, joins a board, and that company is seeking something valuable from government, is that normal career progression, or is that what critics call the revolving door? If a former high-level official calls someone still inside the system about a matter involving a company she's tied to, is that expertise being shared, or is that influence being applied? If the same request gets a different response after the call, is that coincidence, or is it an illustration of how proximity changes outcomes? And if it's just a coincidence, how many coincidences are the rest of us allowed before we start sounding like we're making excuses? These are questions, not verdicts, but you can feel why they sting, because they map too neatly onto what regular people experience when they try to get anything done. Most Americans have had the denied email with no phone number at the bottom. They've had the do not reply notice, the automated shrug, the long hold music, the sense that the system has no curiosity about them as human beings. So when they see a story where one phone call even appears to matter, even appears to change the temperature in the room, they don't need a conspiracy to feel the unfairness. They just need memory, because they remember all the times their own calls didn't matter to anybody. It's not the existence of networks that bothers people, it's the fact that the networks look like shortcuts for some and brick walls for others. And here's the part that makes the whole thing feel like a cultural problem, not a one-man problem. Washington has learned to blur the line between relationships and leverage, and then act insulted when citizens notice the blur. They'll tell you influence doesn't exist, and then they'll throw a fundraiser where the price of a seat is more than a teacher makes in a month. They'll tell you the system is fair, and then they'll hire lobbyists whose entire job is to navigate the system like it's a maze built to reward insiders. So when a case like this pops up, the public reaction isn't, I'm shocked, it's, I'm tired, which is worse for the system, because tired people stop believing anything. And if democracy runs on trust, what happens when trust gets replaced by exhaustion? That's why the rules for the theme keeps landing, because it's not clever, it's familiar. It's the feeling you get when you're told to file something by Friday or face penalties, while someone with a fancy title gets to circle back next quarter. It's the feeling you get when a politician speaks like a hall monitor to the entire country, then acts like a poet when asked to explain his own compliance. It's the sense that standards are weapons, not commitments, and the person holding the weapon decides who gets hit. If you're going to be the national scold, you need to be squeaky clean, not because perfection is realistic, but because hypocrisy is radioactive. And hypocrisy doesn't just hurt the hypocrite, It hurts anyone who ever believed the message. Then the story swerved into the third tension point, the one that's always been gasoline in American politics: process. Not outcomes, not moral conclusions, but whether the process looked like a fair contest or a staged performance. People can disagree about what January 6th was, how to interpret it, what the legal consequences should be, but process questions cut across ideology because process is the rule book. If you teach due process as sacred, how do you justify a process that your critics say lacked basic adversarial testing? If you believe cross-examination is essential to truth-finding, why design a structure where cross-examination doesn't happen the way it would in a courtroom? Again, those are questions, not declarations, but they carry weight because a lot of Americans have watched systems use procedure as a mask. This is where the rhetoric matters, because in politics, investigation can mean searching for truth, or it can mean building a narrative, and sometimes the line between them is thinner than anyone wants to admit. The most cynical view is that Congress doesn't investigate like detectives. It investigates like screenwriters, and the goal is a compelling arc. The most charitable view is that Congress has limitations and isn't a court, so it can't replicate a trial, and that's fair as far as it goes. But the question that lingers is whether the limitations were treated like unavoidable constraints, or whether they were used like strategic advantages. Because when you handpick the frame, you don't just show the public what happened, you tell the public what to think happened. And when people hear that some evidence was discarded or not preserved the way they expected, it triggers a basic instinct. Regular folks don't know the congressional archiving rules, but they know what destroyed sounds like, and they know what it looks like when someone cleans up before inspection. Even if there's a bureaucratic explanation, the optics are brutal, because optics are how politics lives. If your defense is, "Trust me," you're already losing, because trust is exactly what's under debate. So the more the conversation turns into, "You just have to believe the people who already agree with me," the more you push fence-sitters into the arms of cynicism. That cynicism is the real bloodstream of your last section, the one where you zoomed out from Raskin to the whole party ecosystem. And here's the careful way to say what you're trying to say without turning it into a courtroom brief. The public sees different levels of urgency depending on who's accused. They see what feels like asymmetry in attention, in outrage, in follow-through, and whether that's fair or not. In each individual case, the perception piles up like snow. If one side's missteps become front-page morality plays, and the other side's missteps become footnotes with a sympathetic shrug, people stop trusting the referees. And when people stop trusting the referees, they stop believing the rules are real. They start believing the rules are tools. The dangerous question is whether the institutions meant to inform and check power have become part of the power game themselves. You can see why that question is sticky, because it doesn't require you to claim a secret cabal or a cartoonish plot. It just requires you to observe incentives, and incentives are the most honest thing in politics. Media outlets compete for attention. Parties compete for control. Activists compete for influence. And everyone competes to define truth in a way that helps them win. So the audience ends up watching two different movies about the same country, and each movie insists it's the documentary. If you're trying to keep people engaged for a long voiceover, that's the tension that keeps them listening, not a single scandal, but the suspicion that the whole scoreboard is tilted. And the more the system tells people they're crazy for noticing, the more people start thinking maybe noticing is the only sane reaction left. Now, if you want the narration to stay sharp without becoming a pile-on, you have to keep doing what you already set up. Lean on contrasts and questions. How is it that transparency becomes a rallying cry until transparency points inward? Why do standards sound absolute when aimed outward and suddenly become context-dependent when they boomerang back? When did "follow the money" become a slogan reserved for investigating opponents? And why does it feel like a taboo when the trail leads to allies? Why do some people get treated like villains for allegations while others get treated like victims for documentation? And why does every excuse in Washington come wrapped in the same paper? You don't understand how it works, as if that's a defense rather than the indictment. Because if the public doesn't understand how it works, maybe that's intentional. A system that runs best when people tune out has every reason to keep things opaque, procedural, and exhausting. And the more you build a culture where citizens feel like spectators instead of owners, the easier it is for the insiders to treat the place like a private club. That's how you end up with what looks like a permanent class of people who rotate between government, media, academia, nonprofits, and back again, all speaking the same language, all policing the same boundaries. Not because they're evil in a comic book way, but because humans protect their tribes. And Washington is one giant tribe with great catering. So when someone like Vance walks onto that stage and frames the night as prosecution, it resonates because the public has spent years feeling like they're the ones on trial. And that brings you back to the core emotional point that made your original draft work. The two Americas feeling. One America fills out forms, pays fees, waits on hold, and gets told no by faceless systems that never explain themselves. The other America knows a person, makes a call, gets a meeting, and later tells you it was all merit and hard work, like merit comes with a direct line to a Fed president. Maybe that's not always what happened. Maybe it's more complicated. But the perception is powerful because it matches lived experience in 1,000 smaller ways. And the political fight right now is partly a fight over whether the people who feel that imbalance are allowed to say it out loud. If you tell them they're imagining it, don't be surprised when they stop listening to you about anything else. So if you're looking for the through line for the next section, it's this. Hypocrisy isn't just a personal flaw, it's a trust bomb. When the ethics guy looks like he's playing by a different rule book, it doesn't just hurt him, it tells everyone that moral language is marketing. And when moral language becomes marketing, the only thing left is power, because nobody believes the sermon anymore. That's how you get a politics that's all demolition and no building, all outrage and no repair. Because why would anyone invest in a system they don't think is sincere? The most haunting question isn't, did he slip? It's, how many slips are silently forgiven as long as the right people keep saying the right slogans? And if you want this to stay in the lane of social commentary without turning into a direct accusation factory, you keep doing what a seasoned American narrator does. You treat the audience like adults. You lay out contradictions. You ask them to connect dots. And you resist the temptation to declare final verdicts like a judge. You let viewers feel the weight of the contradiction and decide what it means for themselves, because persuasion sticks better when people think they arrived at it on their own. You can even add a touch of dry humor, because humor is how Americans handle rage without blowing a fuse. And the best satire is the kind that sounds like common sense with a smirk. Like saying Washington is the only place where public service can mean serve the public and serve yourself, and everyone just argues over which definition was implied. So the Part 1 landing, the ramp into Part 2, should sharpen the central dilemma. If Raskin is typical, what does typical mean for everyone else still in that machine? How many other sermons are built on missing footnotes? How many other crusades survive on selective scrutiny? How many other committees sell themselves as truth finders while operating like narrative managers, and how many citizens have been asked to clap on cue without ever seeing the raw footage. How long can a democracy run on curated outrage before people stop distinguishing between outrage and truth? And if truth is supposed to be the weapon that cleans the swamp, what happens when every side claims truth while treating facts like props? Because that's the real cliffhanger here. Not whether Raskin survived a rough night on camera, but whether the audience watching has finally started to distrust the whole performance. Not because they've joined some fringe worldview, but because they've noticed the same kind of contradictions in their own workplaces, their own institutions, their own daily interactions with bureaucracy. When you see a rigged feeling system once, you can shrug it off. But when you see it over and over, you start asking whether the rigging is the feature, not the bug. And once that question lodges in someone's mind, it doesn't go away. It just waits for the next example to feed it. So the next part has to answer the unspoken question the audience is already forming. If this isn't about one man, who else is playing the same game? And why do we keep letting them call it virtue? That question doesn't disappear when the lights go out. It follows you home and sits on the couch like an uninvited guest. Be another. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quieter voice asks whether this is accountability or just choreography, whether the system is actually correcting itself or simply rotating the actors while keeping the script intact. What makes this moment different, or at least feel different, is that the contradictions are no longer abstract. They're not buried in academic journals or legislative footnotes. They're playing out in plain sight, in formats designed for mass consumption. When a law professor and a senator stand on the same stage and argue about ethics, it stops being theoretical and starts being visceral. The audience isn't grading a paper. They're measuring credibility, and credibility is built less on eloquence than on alignment between words and behavior. Once that alignment cracks, even slightly, everything said afterward sounds like it's echoing in a hollow room. That's why the revolving door theme hits so hard, even when nobody wants to say the ugliest version of it out loud. Most Americans don't begrudge success, and they don't automatically assume corruption when someone makes money. But they do understand advantage, because advantage is something they can feel even if they can't always name it. They understand the difference between earning something the hard way and being ushered through a side entrance by someone who knows your name. So when public servants talk endlessly about guarding against influence, then seem oddly relaxed when influence brushes up against their own families, it triggers something primal. It's not outrage at first. It's disbelief, the kind that makes you squint at the screen and think you must be missing a chapter. Then comes irritation, because the explanation you're given feels less like clarity and more like a vocabulary test you didn't sign up for. And finally comes resignation, the shrug that says, "Of course that's how it works," which is the most dangerous emotion in a democracy. Resignation is what allows patterns to harden into norms, because nothing corrupts faster than behavior everyone assumes is inevitable. When voters stop expecting fairness, they stop demanding it, and the system quietly thanks them for lowering the bar. That resignation didn't come from nowhere, and it didn't start with Raskin. It's been building for decades, fed by small moments that individually seem survivable but collectively feel suffocating. The senator who retires and immediately becomes a consultant for the industry he once regulated. The regulator who leaves government and lands on a board whose stock price mysteriously jumps 6 months later. The think tank fellow who becomes a cable news expert, who becomes a deputy secretary, who becomes a lobbyist, all without ever changing the suit. In that ecosystem, intent almost stops mattering, because incentives do all the work. You don't need to believe anyone wakes up planning to betray the public. You just need to understand that comfort and access are powerful motivators. If the reward for staying in the goo, that doesn't make them villains, but it does make them predictable. And predictability is exactly what voters are reacting against when they say politics feels fake. So when Vance pressed on process, he wasn't just nitpicking procedure. He was poking at the legitimacy of the whole enterprise. Process is where fairness lives or dies, because outcomes can always be debated, but rules are supposed to be shared. If the rules bend depending on who's being judged, people don't see nuance. They see favoritism. And favoritism is corrosive, because it tells citizens that effort and compliance are optional for some and mandatory for others. That's when cynicism graduates from a mood into a worldview. The January 6th committee questions are a perfect example of this dynamic, regardless of where you land politically. You can believe the event was horrific and still ask whether the investigation was structured to withstand scrutiny from skeptics. You can believe accountability was necessary and still question whether the process maximized trust or merely maximized impact. Those questions aren't a defense of any individual. They're a defense of standards, because standards only matter if they're applied when it's inconvenient. When standards vanish under pressure, they stop being standards and start being tools. That's why the idea that evidence handling or access might have been uneven lands so poorly, with a public already primed to distrust institutions. People have watched enough true crime documentaries to know that even the appearance of evidence mishandling poisons a case. They know juries don't just evaluate facts, they evaluate the people presenting them. So when officials ask the public to accept conclusions without seeing the full process, they're asking for a level of faith that no longer exists. Faith has been burned too many times to be replenished by press releases. And then there's the media layer, the amplifier that can either sharpen accountability or dull it beyond recognition. In theory, journalism is supposed to be the great equalizer, applying pressure regardless of party or personality. In practice, audiences increasingly feel like coverage intensity depends on who's accused and who's doing the accusing. Some stories metastasize instantly, others linger in obscurity, and viewers are left to wonder whether the difference is substance or allegiance. Once that suspicion takes hold, every editorial choice looks like evidence, whether it is or not. This is where humor creeps in, because Americans have always used humor to survive institutional disappointment. Late-night jokes about Congress being a retirement plan, memes about public service, funding private lifestyles, sarcasm about speaking fees that somehow align with policy positions. Laughter becomes a coping mechanism, a way to acknowledge unfairness without drowning in it. But humor can also mask anger, and masked anger doesn't disappear. It waits. It waits for a moment that feels honest enough to unleash it. That's why moments like this debate feel catalytic, even if nothing changes immediately afterward. They give language to a feeling people have struggled to articulate, the sense that the rules are less about justice than about maintenance of status. When someone finally says, "Apply your own standard to yourself," it resonates not because it's clever, but because it's obvious. Obvious truths are the most dangerous to entrenched systems, because they can't be neutralized with jargon. You can argue policy all day, but it's hard to argue against a mirror. The Supreme Court ethics segment underscored that perfectly, because it exposed how moral framing shifts depending on proximity. When ethical lapses are distant, they're treated as existential threats to democracy. When ethical lapses are closer to home, they become unfortunate oversights, misunderstood timelines, or distractions from more important work. The language changes, the urgency fades, and suddenly nuance becomes the hero of the story. People notice these shifts instinctively, even if they can't quote the letters or hearings verbatim. The phrase, "rules for thee, but not for me," sticks because it compresses all of this into something portable. It's the bumper sticker version of a graduate seminar on power dynamics, and that's why it spreads. You don't need to know the details of any specific case to recognize the feeling behind it. You've lived it at work, at school, in interactions with bureaucracy, anywhere authority exists. So when a public figure uses that phrase against others and then appears vulnerable to it themselves, the irony writes itself. At that point, the debate stops being about who's right and starts being about who's credible. Credibility is fragile because it's cumulative, built from dozens of small alignments between speech and action. One misalignment doesn't destroy it, but repeated ones erode it quietly until a single moment exposes how thin it's become. That's what made the audience reaction so telling, the way applause curdled into discomfort when the lens turned inward. People weren't just reacting to a man, they were reacting to a realization. And that realization extends beyond any single party or ideology, which is why it's so destabilizing. Once voters believe that ethical language is selectively deployed, they start discounting it everywhere. They stop distinguishing between sincere reformers and opportunists using reform as branding. They start assuming every crusade has a hidden carve-out. Every demand comes with an escape hatch. In that environment, even good faith efforts get drowned out by suspicion, because trust has been overdrawn. That's the paradox the system now faces. The more leaders preach about norms and values without living them visibly, the more they accelerate the collapse of belief in norms and values altogether. People don't reject standards because they hate standards. They reject standards because they see them weaponized. They don't stop caring about ethics. They stop believing ethics are real in public life. And once ethics feel fictional, politics becomes pure power struggle, which is exactly what the founders feared. This is why the Biden family oversight segment, hinted at but not fully unpacked yet, feels like a natural next chapter rather than a tangent. It's not about one family or one president. It's about consistency in curiosity. Do investigators pursue every credible lead with the same energy, or does enthusiasm fluctuate with party affiliation? Do bank records become serious evidence or partisan theater depending on whose name is on them? And if oversight committees treat evidence differently based on politics, what does oversight even mean? These questions don't require a conclusion to be unsettling. They are unsettling precisely because they linger unanswered. A system confident in its fairness welcomes scrutiny, because scrutiny reinforces legitimacy. A system defensive about its fairness treats scrutiny as an attack, because legitimacy is already brittle. When officials respond to questions with mockery or dismissal instead of transparency, they reveal more than they intend. They reveal fear, not of truth, but of loss of control over the narrative. Narratives are the currency of modern politics, and controlling them has become more important than resolving underlying problems. If you can frame an inquiry as malicious, you don't have to answer it. If you can label evidence as discredited early enough, you can inoculate your audience against future revelations. This strategy works until it doesn't, until the audience starts noticing the pattern of preemptive dismissal. Once they notice, every denial sounds rehearsed. Every assurance feels defensive. That's where the sense of two justice systems takes root, not as a slogan but as an intuition. One system that moves fast, loudly, and relentlessly when the accused are politically convenient. Another system that moves slowly, quietly, or not at all when the accused are politically valuable. People don't need to read law review articles to feel that difference. They experience it emotionally. And emotional conclusions, fair or not, are incredibly hard to dislodge. This brings us back to the larger thesis you're circling without hammering directly. Raskin isn't the disease, he's a symptom, a particularly articulate expression of a broader dysfunction. A dysfunction where moral authority is self-assigned, accountability is optional, and credibility is assumed rather than earned. A dysfunction where institutions talk endlessly about restoring trust without changing the behaviors that eroded trust in the first place. And a dysfunction where citizens are expected to applaud sermons while quietly ignoring the footnotes. If Part 1 asked whether the culture is the problem, Part 2 starts asking what happens if the culture doesn't change. What happens when voters decide that every ethics argument is just a costume change? What happens when calls for reform are interpreted as power plays rather than principles? What happens when the language of democracy becomes so saturated with hypocrisy that it loses its persuasive force? Because at that point, politics stops being about persuasion and starts being about domination. That's the tension you want to carry forward, not anger for its own sake, but unease. The unease of realizing that the system might be teaching the wrong lesson, rewarding performance over integrity. The unease of watching institutions defend their own while scolding everyone else. The unease of sensing that the people who claim to guard democracy may be unintentionally hollowing it out. And the uneasy question that follows all of it. If this keeps going, who will anyone believe when real accountability is actually needed? That question hangs there, unresolved, which is exactly where you want to leave it before moving deeper. Because the next step isn't to yell louder, it's to examine how selective enforcement of principles shapes public behavior, how citizens adapt when they believe fairness is negotiable, how resentment builds when moral language feels disconnected from lived reality, and how a democracy quietly changes when people stop expecting their leaders to live by the same rules they enforce.